Ernie, I want to talk a bit about political correctness and slant it towards the question of what books people ought to read in order to become educated, to be able to live as good citizens, and to find some transcendent values in their lives. It's a question, how do we educate people? In a university setting, it's the question of what is the canon, the sort of unofficial list of books that educated people ought to have read, or that become the basis of what some have called the great conversation. It's a debate about the great books, what should be included in that listing. And of course, we've lined up opponents on each side of this question. We have people saying that we ought to read the traditional Western classics, going back to Homer and Plato and Aristotle, and reading people like Augustine and Aquinas and the great philosophers of Europe in modern times, and so on. And and Shakespeare, the literary works and so on, and that's what has shaped our Western consciousness, and that's what people should learn if they're going to be educated. On the other side of this debate, we find people saying that, that is restrictive. That is, those are all male authors. They're all Western. They're all got a sexist and racist bias in what they write. And if we just read those people, we won't be in touch with reality. We won't have a proper sense of multicultural realities. And that we need to expand the canon or break it down and rewrite this whole unofficial listing of books that we ought to read. So that is perhaps just to set the debate here on politically correct ideas as related to what we ought to read.
It's interesting to me, Jim, that the canon, as you and I think of it, has formed and shaped you and I and our values to a great extent. Our parents were brought up with similar canon, and we were brought up with the same canon, the same voices saying the same things. So pieces of this canon became part of our value system, and if we were running departments of English at the university, I suspect we would be attempting to pass the same books on down to our students. We know these books. They are known. There is lots of commentary. There's a lot more commentary about Plato than there is about Richard Wright or Toni Morrison or James Baldwin. So that the line of least resistance says, yes, we pass down Plato, or perhaps, more current example of white male, Scott Fitzgerald or Hemingway rather than Richard Wright.
Well, you make a good point that we come at it with our own bias. In other words, if indeed we've been shaped by particular books or ideas, we tend to give them value. We treasure those things. It becomes part of the currency of the culture, so to speak, and we would say, well, why doesn't everybody get in on those things? Why can't we all read those books and be influenced by them? And then we'll have a common language. I think to take the one side of the argument, if we do that, then we'll have a common language, we'll have common symbols, common categories that we can use to discuss. And out of that, we can find better policies. We can learn to get along better as diverse people in this culture, because at least we have a basis for civil discourse then. If we haven't read the same things, how are we going to talk? Or, I think the other part of the argument is, if you haven't read these things, how will you really understand anything? If you haven't read the Bible, how will you understand the phrase, the handwriting on the wall? Or, how will you come up with, the Odyssey? If you don't know something about the Homeric tales, how will you understand when people are talking about the Odyssey of life and so on?
I agree, but then, of course, the counter-argument becomes, well, if you haven't read the Bible, then you haven't read Genesis 2, which says that God gave man dominion over, etc., 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 with the idea that dominion suggested domination, and it was his to do with as he so liked. So, as there's an upside to the common currency, there's a downside, because the common currency tends to be white, male-centered, without any particular sensitivity to other voices or even to the other, the idea of the other. I suspect that your experience and my experience of the other has been to some extent shaped by readings by, say, a James Baldwin or a Kate Millett or an Andrea Dworkin, who give us a sense of what it is like to be on the margins. I don't know how long ago you added Dorothy Day to your public lecture series, but she certainly gave us a different voice than we were accustomed to hearing, and offered a different role model for females than was certainly popular up until recently.
Now, that's a good point, to take up the other side of this very perplexing argument that goes on is, well said that there's the experience, for example, of women and minorities, as many would say, has been erased from history, precisely because the books that have shaped our consciousness have been by white males and members of the dominant class in society, and therefore the experience is erased. It was there. It was probably recorded in some ways by those on the margins, and yet we don't have it. It's not part of our cultural heritage. So what has been erased must be written back in. We must recapture, in a sense, that. And I think part of the argument is that when you do that, you will recapture a history of suffering. You'll recapture a whole experience that is different from what the dominant group has known. And one will find a solidarity in that. I think that becomes part of the argumentation for resurrecting the marginalized literature, that we will see that people have had a similarity of experience. When you are excluded, you know what it's like when others are excluded. You work out of that experience.
And of course, then once we are aware of that experience of exclusion, then it seems to me we are obligated to respond to it. We can't say, oh, okay, you were excluded. It was not a good place for you. It was diminishing. Essentially, your existence had no hope and no future. Once we recognize that, once we name that, once we have that named for us, it seems to me out of a pure sense of justice, we are obligated to respond to it by making changes. So the canon becomes non-canonical, and we start looking at what we should add to fully flesh it out, to bring the other along with us, or to bring us along with the other, to become unified.
That begins to point to a solution to this dilemma, doesn't it? A lot of this has gotten focused again in the universities, although I don't think it's just a university issue. It has to do with how we educate ourselves as a public, as a nation, how we learn to get along, how we become more sensitive to the multicultural dimension in our culture. So it is a wider question than just what is on the freshman reading list at universities. But again, this politically correct debate that is going on under that rubric, politically correct thinking, it has gotten focused on the universities and the question of what do you read, what is required reading. And it seems as though that I think Stanford University was much in the news in the 1980s in wrestling with this kind of question, and then many other universities followed along. There is the claim by Professor D'Souza. I notice he has an article in the Wall Street Journal of September 24th, 1991, when he takes up this question of a multicultural reading list, as he calls it. But in his article, he's claiming that there are universities, and he mentions Dartmouth and Wisconsin, Berkeley, Mount Holyoke, that require students to take non-Western or ethnic studies, but do not require them to study the basic ingredients of Western history, politics, or literature. Now, I really don't know if that's true. I don't know if those universities do that. It sounds rather odd to me that they would. do it that way, make requirements of non-Western or ethnic studies and no requirements of Western history. But that's an example of what the other side, which Irving Howe has called the cultural traditionalists, are saying that this is wrong. This is a charge being made, that we've moved in the other direction so much that people are required to read these other books by women authors, by African authors, and are not reading the Western classics.
Exactly. They are in their own way just as exclusive as excluding as that those books written by dead white European Western males. So it becomes another centrism, another either or, rather than ideally a both and, where all voices can be expressed well. When we talk about the argument being limited to the university, it is, but we must remember that universities train our high school and our elementary school and secondary school teachers and train them with particular reading lists. So any child, even if they don't go to college, is still experiences the college canon, that those readings that the English department at the particular university think are important. So this is really pervasive through all kids that go to school. Some people who speak up for the idea of revising the canon say that we need to restore the self-esteem, bolster the self-esteem of the minorities by adding their material to the reading list. Other people, like D'Souza, go the other way and say essentially that a reading list is not intended to provide group therapy for the self-esteem of minorities.
Yes, that's well put in terms of the argument that goes on. The approach that you were indicating earlier, which is an inclusive approach, which I think would be generally said, let's expand the books that we read so that we would include women authors and that we would include people of other cultures, African authors, Asian authors, and so on, that the answer to the problem is inclusion, in other words, expand the canon. I notice, again, Professor D'Souza claims that Stanford, which took that kind of approach, he says that the end result of this, and I'm quoting now, it degenerates into the uncritical depreciation of Western classics as racist, sexist, and homophobic against the gay community, combined with ethnic cheerleading for when the subject is minority or third world cultures. So that's his charge again from the cultural traditionalists, is that even this inclusive approach, as it's actually played out, ends up putting down Western culture and all emphasizing the sexism and racism found in the classic works like Plato and Aristotle or Immanuel Kant or Martin Heidegger of our own 20th century, and that it plays up, on the other hand, the glories of this other literature. Now, again, I have no way of knowing how that plays out, but I'm just saying what the challenge of the cultural traditionalists is to the kind of viewpoint that you've been enunciating.
Exactly. My sense is that people like D'Souza tend to exaggerate the argument in both directions because it gives them more press time and recognition than they've ever had before. Just the idea of a canon implies that this is an authoritative version and that there are some authorities somewhere who have decided that this is what we should read, add this, exclude that, etc. And the reality is that reading lists have been in process since the country was founded and universities were founded. In terms of, there are some books that have been kept, some books that have been given up. Along the same line, I think we have to factor in the idea of good teaching, effective pedagogy here. For instance, Shakespeare is one of my favorites. And yet, teaching him, I recognize how incredibly misogynist he was in terms of his views and the way he talked about women. So it seems to me, as a teacher, I have an obligation when I present him as a great example in certain terms. I also have to hold up at the same time the misogynist factor, as I might hold up a Socratic dialogue from Plato and say that Socrates maybe deserved the hemlock the way he was treating this person and this person and this person through argument.
I think that's very well said, Ernie, that this highlighting the role of the teacher. I mean, it seems to me that it depends on how you teach these great books, whatever they are, whether they are Shakespeare or Immanuel Kant, or whether we're reading James Baldwin, black author. I mean, the question when we're studying these people should be to approach them with some sort of critical sense, to see what are the values there that we can latch onto that help us, and where would we be critical of their presuppositions and assumptions. That's part of what learning would be all about, to learn to read critically. And again, I don't think it's just people who are currently in school that need to be interested in that, but all of us interacting in the culture and listening to Supreme Court hearings, or whether we're trying to figure out how to make sense out of our work life or what we read in the newspapers, need to bring that kind of critical sense to it, so that not everything that is written down is absolute truth, whether it's in a classic work or in the daily newspaper. So one has to develop a sense of judgment and criteria by which one would make judgments about what is true and false, or good and bad, or beautiful and ugly. That becomes part of what it means to be an educated person and to be a good participant in the society. So I think that's a crucial point here. That I mean, Professor D'Souza seems to me is sort of overboard in his argumentation. I'm sure there's people at Stanford who teach great books and who do so as excellent teachers and develop critical thinking around them. And I think it's vitally important in that inclusive canon that we would learn about the other cultures and how they see things.
Yes, I still think the revised canon is an authentic way of understanding the experience of the other. The revised canon also offers the possibility of some really fine, excellent literature that might never have surfaced if it weren't for people making a thrust toward busting up the canon, making a thrust toward, say, some sort of multiculturalism. I have read things that I never would have found before, and I suspect you have, if it hadn't been for other voices being brought in front of us. So, there's upsides to this idea of the canon. There are downsides. I think we have to agree, though, that it is in process. One needs to bring a critical mind to the reading, the experience of the literature. One needs to teach it well, to put it up for public discourse, as you have mentioned before, John Courtney Murray's idea of a public dialogue, a public philosophy. We have more people involved in that discussion. We're more aware of who the public is, and hopefully we're doing a better job of listening to more voices without suspending our critical faculties.
Ernie, it's interesting the way this political correctness is a question and debate is sort of realigned forces. I noticed that the New Republic in the February 18th, 1991 edition printed a lot of articles on this topic, and one of the authors they have in there is Irving Howe, a well-known voice from the left. And he's even asked the question, well, don't you feel uncomfortable being in this group of people who are attacking political correctness in a way? And Irving Howe writes in favor of the traditional canon. And he points out that even Marxists have seen the importance of this. I think he quotes Leon Trotsky, among others, in this article that is saying how they have argued for the need for this culture of the past to be handed on, and how it helps to give a certain coherence. And Irving Howe goes on to argue that we can become good citizens by studying this traditional canon. He's not opposed to including other literature, expanding it, but he thinks that we do have in here a really valuable resource. And one of the things he says is that the canon, while it is biased, is not monolithic. While the traditional books that we read, Western civilization, literature, philosophy, and so on, is biased, there's no doubt about that. It comes out of a particular tradition, and the language shapes the perceptions of reality and so on. But it's not monolithic. In other words, Plato and Aristotle saw the world quite differently. As people have said, one was pointing up to the idealism of the skies, and other one was pointing down, Aristotle, to the real world that need to be classified and carefully analyzed and so on. So you get different perceptions of political questions in John Locke as opposed to Edmund Burke, or, it's not a simple matter at all. So he says you can teach the Western tradition in a way that would create debate about the great questions. Now, I recognize that the multiculturalists are going to say that, well, that's not sufficient, because while they're different, they still all have a particular bias, which is for dead white European males, as they say.
Exactly. Yeah. Though I would make the point, I would have to agree with how, in some respects, when I think of Plato writing the Symposium, for instance, and Plato and the ancient Greek feeling that the ultimate in love one for another was the older man for the younger boy. Now, to surface that idea today, nobody would say that the canon supported homosexual behavior, and yet if one looks at ancient Greece, or looks at Oscar Wilde or other authors, one finds threads wandering through that support what some of the people are trying to get at when they talk about opening up the canon. Well, the canon already contains perhaps some of these voices. We've just been putting the wrong angle on them.
I want to go back to that self-esteem question that you raised before, because I think it's really crucial. People on the margins have trouble establishing self-esteem. In fact, I think all human beings do, because all human beings have a tendency to sort of put ourselves down, or to see the flaws, or to really zero in on the failures in life. I think that's a sort of common human tendency. And but people on the margins who are not getting positive feedback very often have a greater difficulty with this. And one of the arguments has been, for example, if black students in the university can concentrate on black studies and read black literature, they will recognize themselves in it. They will be affirmed. If they read James Baldwin and his graphic scenes from the South, and read his novels, that they will see their own struggles and experience here, and in doing so will find an affirmation, and may well find also more models for living as a black person in the United States today. I think that argument has to be taken with some seriousness, but Irving Howe again tries to counter that, and again we must remember he's a voice from the left, and with great empathy for minority groups, says that he has examples of black authors who were very influenced in their own upbringing and growth by white authors, and who have learned something from the Western canon that we traditionally read. And he says that he's not so sure that can't be a source of inspiration and guidance for minority groups as well. So again, you see the argument on both sides.
Yes, it's also interesting to me, and Howe doesn't mention this argument, but you and I and a number of others who have been almost totally formed and sensitized by the traditional canon somehow found within ourselves the sensitivity from that canon to question our own assumptions regarding the canon. We are responding, we have responded in the past by opening the canon up gradually, certainly, but we are part of what we are reviewing. We have been formed by Plato and Aristotle and Shakespeare and Dickens and Thackeray and Jane Austen, etc. And apparently that formation has brought up some sort of moral sensitivity and sense of justice along with the Bible, which causes us to even talk publicly about these questions. And I think that's valuable.
Well, I think it is. There is an Enlightenment tradition that we know in the Western world as you begin to move with Descartes and Kant and Hegel in the modern world. There is an Enlightenment tradition that says we must be self-critical. So in a sense, it moves us along that line. Just looking at Professor de Souza's list, he says we could add to the reading list by reading some of the great religious works, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, Confucius's Analects, and so on, the Quran, that could become part of what we read. Well, Ernie, we've been talking about political correctness here and looking at the slant here that has to do with the official reading list, the unofficial list, the canon, what we expect educated people to read. And I come down on the side of some sort of inclusionary approach, that an expansion of the canon to make sure that there are women authors included and my representatives minority groups, but they're each read from a critical viewpoint, I think, as you pointed out. And that allows us to learn and see commonality and perhaps helps to bring us together.